Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more overly sarcastic productions, and we are returning to Blue in his newest video, History Makers, Iceland's #1 menace, Snorri Sturluson. Before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description, in the description box. Fucking shit. In the description box below. I'd love you to join the Discord and follow me over at Twitch, and please do go check out the gaming channel here on YouTube. Now, no yapping. I've got to contain my yap. Let's dive in.
The study of Norse mythology is, quite simply, a game of picking up scraps and trying our darndest to make sense of them. The ancient Greeks,
Yeah.
Egyptians, Babylonians, and friends wrote down stories on stories on stories because literature was their repository for culture, but your average Scandinavian at the height of the Viking Age wouldn't have any reason to write down their myths. They knew their religion, their community knew it, and anyone who wanted to learn a story could just ask their local storyteller. What's a hunk of parchment good for when you've got people? This makes perfect sense and is also academically infuriating. The most we can glean about Norse
All right, so largely you can blame the Christians for this. Really, that's really what it comes down to. When Christian missionaries come in, right, they start to gain control. One of the things that Christianity does, because of how the religion works, is that and so they don't, right? They don't write this shit down because that's not part of their culture. But then Christianity comes in and it starts, getting rid of the traditional beliefs and religious stories because it doesn't line up with God, God and Jesus and whatnot. And so those other stories, if they cannot be intertwined into the new Christian society, it get forgotten. Um, and I don't like this statement because it's kind of, there's no real good way of wording this. Like I mean, I can understand being upset about a lack of written down sources, but also, I we can't, like, I don't know, like, it rubs me the wrong way to kind of be upset at a culture for not writing something down, you know? Like, it's not their fault that the stories are forgotten. The stories would have been remembered if it weren't for outside factors, which is the case in multiple things across the world. It isn't just a solely, like, um, a European effect on, say, Africa. It isn't just, like, this stuff happens outside. It's just also the best and most fresh in our mind example of the loss of oral stories is European colonization in parts of the world, and the spread of Christianity throughout Europe also got rid of a lot of oral stories because of just how Christianity works, just because of how that faith works. And so, yeah, it just rubs me the wrong way when I hear like complaints or like I'm not happy things weren't written down or whatever. Like I wrote an essay um on African, it was pre-colonial Africa. It was like a compare and contrast North Africa and Sub-Saharan West Africa and how they developed politically or whatever, in I chopped it into three separate time periods. I put in pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. The post-colonial was very brief. Um, and I spent half of the page, my maximum page length, ranting about how these goddamn white European historians were complaining about the lack of written sources, and that there was one that really pissed me off. There was this one white Europe. I think he was Norwegian. I think it was the Norwegian European historian who was talking about, like, we have a lack of African perspective, and I'm going to leave but they still have a lot of oral traditions surviving even after the atrocities of colonialism. But I do not feel it is right. He did not. He was like, I do not feel it is my job to, or something like that, to go and collect the oral stories. He's like, I believe it should be a African that goes and collects those stories. And I fucking ranted about that because it's like, bro, you're a fucking historian. Your job, and specifically, you are writing a history book on colonial West Africa. Your job is to get the facts from multiple sources, not just the written down European fucking sources. One felt fucking lazy and disingenuous to me. I was fucking pissed about it. I think I only missed one singular point on that essay. I think my teacher liked my rant. And it pissed me the fuck off. So I think part of the beauty, this one, it sucks that we lose a lot of oral stories through the course of time, but also I kind of find it a bit beautiful at the same time. Um, is it frustrating? Yes, but we also lose written down sources. We have lost many written sources over the course of human time. It's just that written sources have an ability to have a better chance at lasting longer than non-written sources. But yeah, that was just a tangent I had to go on because this kind of rubs me wrong. I'm not blaming red. I'm not blaming blue for this at all. It just this kind of statement. I don't think there's really a good way to say it.
Norse myth from the Viking Age itself comes from place names in reference to the gods and scattered runestones carved with blessings or short phrases of poetry. But around the year 1000, the Scandinavian kingdoms convert to Christianity and cool it with the paganism. Then 2 centuries after that, we get our 2 and only 2 major written collections of Norse mythology, the Poetic and Prose Eddas, appearing not in mainland Scandinavia, but all the way over in Iceland. Now, compared with the rest of the Viking world, Iceland was by far the best positioned to create a textual record of the culture, but that doesn't guarantee it would be written by someone who wasn't an absolute madman. And that brings us to one Snorri Sturluson, poet, politician, biggest wildcard in Icelandic history.
The man who makes Diogenes seem tame. That's a claim there, Blue. Let's see how you hold up with it.
And, unfortunately, our best hope. So, to learn how Iceland's #1 menace lent us half the corpus of Norse mythology, let's do some history. The mythology we call Norse arose from a shared Germanic culture reaching from Britain through Northern Europe and into Scandinavia, speaking similar Germanic-based languages and worshipping similar deities. But by the time the Vikings got going in the 800s AD, they were the only ones still on the pagan party boat. And of that bunch, Iceland was always the odd one out. It was permanently settled in the late 800s by, among other various travelers, Norwegian aristocrats who hated the idea of Norway having a king now and got the absolute hell out of there. So in their
centralized king
new home, they created a pointedly anti-royal commonwealth governed by their parliament, the Althing. And this uniquely collective arrangement made them the only ones to vote to convert to Christianity in 1000 AD. The mainland kingdoms imposed it top-down and fiercely, but Iceland essentially struck a compromise. Christianity was the public religion, but whomst anyone might have worshipped at home was nobody's business. That earned them the benefits of trade with the rest of the Christian world, while Icelanders regarded stories about the gods as harmless rather than heresy. And the Icelanders loved to tell stories. It kept them entertained through the cold winters and long nights and was their main connection to a shared Scandinavian ancestry reaching back to their homelands. The skill set for storytelling also mirrored the skills required for Iceland's main
law speaker Logmother was responsible for memorizing and reciting the entirety of Icelandic law to decide cases. They also presided over the Althing. Local Godar were similar but smaller. Good speech was essential at every level.
Public servants, the leading law speaker, or logmaður, and the many regional goðar. These officials essentially memorized Iceland's laws and could recite them.
Memory, recitation, and production of high-quality speech was essential to governance as it was culture. Poetry is a different context, but the exact same core skill set. They're not just complementary, each craft. And here's the thing. This is true for any sort of culture that practices oral storytelling. I don't know how... Probably the 20th century. Honestly, probably the fucking Victorians are to blame for this. I don't know how we got here, but somehow people have this idea that oral storytelling was just kind of something like, in a way, yes, everyone did participate in oral storytelling, but it was also, there was someone that it was their job to remember the stories of the village, of the people. And it was a very tough job. Like, they were fierce on it. Now, of course, there is still going to be um storytelling drift over time, right? That's going to happen from generation to generation. That is going to fucking happen. No source that you go to is going to be perfect, right? There's going to be drift and bias in every single story, even in written stories. So it's all based upon the perspective of the person telling it and their lived experience. I don't the fucking stupid ass belief that written sources are more reliable than oral tradition. Bullshit. Don't believe it. It's bullshit. It's fucking colonial. It was essentially used as colonial propaganda. Propaganda would be the right fucking word, but it was essentially a way to racism kind of shit. Essentially, obviously not racism in the context of Iceland and here because they were white, but like in the context of colonialism when it came to Africa and Asia and whatnot and the Americas. Anyways,
From memory to
I am if oral stories don't have any defenders, it means I'm fucking dead and I haven't found a way to resurrect myself.
settle disputes, not terribly far off from the talents of a poet, and likely a large part of why Icelandic stories have so many dang courtroom dramas. All of Iceland's unique circumstances add up to a culture which prized memorization and recitation, expressed their heritage through stories of their ancestors, had a lot of spare time in the evenings, and was comparatively much more chill with reminiscing about paganism. Even before Christianization, Icelanders were regarded as the best poets in Scandinavia, having invented the saga as a genre of performance. But especially after Christianization, they remained the repository of ancestral and mythological knowledge via their poetry. Strictly speaking, the sagas are mostly prose, not poetry, but it's the same core idea, so yeah. Then, around the 1100s, they got their hands on the Latin alphabet and started writing stuff down. First was bits of poetry, then a codification of the laws in 1115, and by the 1200s, the sagas and full myths. The earliest collection is an anonymous, untitled work from the turn of the 13th century-ish, compiling mythological poems from different places and times, known to us today as the Poetic Edda. Half of the work recounts stories of deities, and half focuses on human heroes. It isn't comprehensive, but it's a pretty dang good account of how Icelanders in general understood the myths they received from their ancestors through storytelling. Then, there's the other book on Norse myths, and that brings us to possibly the single most consequential figure in Icelandic history for two very different reasons. Sometime after the anonymous Poetic Edda, the poet Snorri Sturluson composed Iceland's second major work of Norse myth literature, the Prose Edda. Originally titled as just Edda and retitled for convenience by later historians, Snorri's work is part catalogue of myths, part instruction manual for poetry, and part praise poem for the King of Norway. This is the primary reason for Snorri's lasting fame, but at the time it was a distant second to his career in politics. Mr. Sturluson is, quite simply, the biggest menace in Icelandic history and singularly responsible for the most ruinously bloody period of civil war the island ever had. Permit me a detour into Icelandic politics to demonstrate how utterly low-key-brained this man was. Snorri was a member of a powerful clan known as the Sturlungar, or Sturlungs. He was educated in language, law, and culture in the 1180s and 90s and was elected as Iceland's law speaker in 1215. He served his term and left in 1218 to go buddy up with the teenage Hakon IV, who just became king of Norway. The Norwegian kings had their eyes on Iceland for centuries, and Hakon was itching to go to war and bring Iceland into his realm, but Snorri convinced the king that he could sway the Althing to vote for a union rather than resorting to violence. This was a noble idea, and very stupid. Snorri came back to Iceland and served as law speaker from 1222 to 1232, during which time he hoped to consolidate power over the Gothar and present Iceland to Hakon on a silver platter, whereupon Hakon would say thank you, call him handsome, and make him regent of Iceland on behalf of the king. Instead, half the island and most of his own family hated this plan and violently opposed it, including nephews and some of his own sons. Granted, Snorri's personal life is a saga of so much philandering, divorces, and
He had at least 6 children between 2 wives and 3 mistresses. but Lord knows how much else.
Legitimate children that we wouldn't be stretching to change a letter and call him Snorri Sturluson, but the political outcome of lots of sons was lots of
The age of the Sturlungs, 42 years of internal violence and political chaos in Iceland from 1220 to 1262, as the 39 Godar vied for power ever over pocket realms, ultimately destroying the Commonwealth.
rivals. That all spilled out to over 40 years of factional violence in Iceland, known as the Age of the Sturlungs, which is one very small step short of calling it the War of Snorri's Screw-Ups. Of course, Iceland didn't have the population to sustain huge armies campaigning for months on end, but a battle with a couple thousand soldiers is pretty grande by the standards of an otherwise quiet island. Snorri proved thoroughly incapable of keeping a lid on the conflict and went to Norway again in 1237 to make more bad decisions, allying with Hakon's duplicitous regent Skuli against the king, only for Skuli to get killed in 1240 and Hakon to hold enough of a grudge to send assassins after his bestie turned traitor Snorri. Thus are the consequences of the Grima Wormtongue grind set. Poor Mr. Sturluson was killed at his home by agents of the king in 1241, in an outcome that can only be described as entirely his fault and completely avoidable. The conflict continued in the decades after and culminated in the Althing voting to submit to Norway in 1262. What a mess. With this cursed knowledge,
Snorri.
we also can't be surprised that the main chronicle of the conflict, the Sturlunga saga, depicts Snorri as a scheming little weasel whose career had way too many consequences. Not quite fair, but not that off base. Considering that this national disaster of a man is also the island's single most famous poet, let's turn now to Snorri's literary career, bearing in mind that this man is essentially the equivalent of if William Shakespeare personally started the War of the Roses. It's more than fair to ask why this guy of all Icelanders left us the prose Edda, but his literary motivations weren't far off from his political ones. The mythological subject matter connects Iceland and Norway in a shared cultural heritage, and the instructional portions about how to understand and compose poetry address young poets in particular, as they'll
But these things have now to be told to young poets who desire to learn the language of poetry and to furnish themselves with a wide vocabulary using traditional terms. Then let such a one take this book as scholarly inquiry and entertainment.
be the
Skaldskaparmál.
ones in the royal courts of Norway entertaining
Inga
their
Durkin
patrons.
Hurrigan.
Icelandic poets were already in high demand on the mainland, and Snorri likely anticipated a political union would only grow that market. The myths then served as illustrative examples for poets to study. But even if pure cultural preservation wasn't the priority, Snorri was certainly conscious of what he was doing. The precise original format of the Prose Edda is contested, as are its possible inspirations from Latin grammar treatises, but later editions show Icelanders being more interested in the Edda's instruction manuals for poetry than its myths. And that makes sense for the time period. The myths were certainly engaging, but they were old, distant, and slowly falling out of fashion. It was only in the 1600s, after the rediscovery of the Poetic Edda and the first Latin translation of the Prose Edda, that popular interest in Norse myths got going. And it's looking at his mythological content that we notice some really weird stuff from Snorri, stuff that calls into question whether we can trust the guy. Notably, a very Christian-sounding ending to the Ragnarok story, plus claiming there's a realm of an even higher heavenliness above Asgard and Valhalla, and that the Aesir are actually heroes from the Trojan War? Huh?
Huh?
It's weird, and it's really jarring to run into this stuff when you're just here to see Loki get up to shenanigans, but it's not as wonky as it first seems. Essentially, these are the consequences of telling the stories in a post-Christian context, but the actual effect on the narratives is pretty light. The Trojan Aesir, for instance, is a framing device confined mostly to the prologue, done largely as a handwave to dispel any accusations of residual paganism. If the Aesir are Trojans, they aren't gods, and therefore aren't a threat to the church or the faith. This idea is also not original to Snorri, as a
The Icelandic book. The Icelandic. Shut up, I'm giving up on that one. There's a history text from the 1100s that does the same Trojan Aesir dance way before Snorri. In the 1200s, the Trojan. Fucking shit. Expands on the idea.
historical text from a century earlier pulls the same Trojan Aesir business, and the sus-looking ending to Ragnarok can't.
The prose and poetic Eddas are the first records of the poem Voluspa, but the original composition can be dated to the late 900s pre-Christianization because of stress patterns predating a vowel merger in the early 1000s. Linguists fucking, they're insane.
possibly be Snorri's bright idea because the original poem comes from the 900s. So, in context and with an attentive eye, these spurious Christianizing editions are pretty easy to just pretend we didn't see and carry on enjoying the stories. Or, in the case of Ragnarok, actually seem legit. Our best evidence is that the overall tone and content of the Poetic and Prose Eddas are very similar. The anonymous Poetic Edda just skipped the heresy begone framing device. So the question we're left with as we get ready to crack into our copies of the Prose Edda is, can we really trust this weaselly, duplicitous boy to tell us anything accurate about Norse mythology? Essentially, we kinda have to, but honestly, we actually can. Snorri's intent was to present a shared heritage between Iceland and Norway and teach young poets through superlative examples from a vast bank of poetry Iceland was uniquely positioned to cultivate. Aside from some additions we can discard as obvious nonsense, his work is broadly consistent with the Poetic Edda, which, as far as we can tell, is the authentic received poetry from generations of Icelandic storytellers. So any invisible Christian bias in the stories isn't unique to Snorri. This man was an absolute human tornado who subjected Icelanders to generations of conflict in his quest to kiss up to Norway, but Iceland's agony is our swagony because the man wrote a mean book of myths. Thank you for watching. This video was...
And that was History Maker's Iceland's #1 menace, Snorri Sturluson. I definitely am realizing that I have gotten really rough on my, on my Norse history here. A couple years ago, I would have been able to talk way more in length on this topic. But not anymore. I need to get back into it. Shit. Shit. Oh man. But it's honestly hard to fucking find history textbooks, good, and good reliable history books, on stuff that is essentially outside of England and Rome. And World War II. So it's tough. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. This video was okay. Blue's done better. I think, yeah, this one was okay. I've got really no complaints aside from just that at the beginning, the way he phrased that oral story stuff just kind of rubbed me wrong. Just probably my brain being my brain. But I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.